Hi everyone, my name is Philippa. So today we're going to be doing writing task 1, focusing on the academic side of the writing test. So if you look in your book, you will see a diagram. In fact, it is 2 bar graphs, and this is in your book in chapter 4. Okay, so first of all, we're going to look at the summary sentence. In the IELTS task 1, when you receive the question, you will see the diagram, but at the top of the diagram, there is a summary which gives us some information about what the diagram or diagrams is all about. So today, we're going to be looking at 2 bar graphs or bar charts. So before you start writing, it's very important that you really understand what the diagram is showing us. So the best thing to do is read the sentence at the top of the diagram, paraphrase it, so use some synonyms, and you will also need to use these synonyms to write your introduction. But also it will help you to understand a little bit better. So if we look at the sentence today, it says, the bar chart below shows the percentage of the school-aged population who receive a secondary education and the percentage of the adult population who receive higher education by region and gender. So in that statement, there are lots of synonyms that we could use. The best thing to do is focus on the nouns and use a thesaurus. For example, the word shows, you could use the synonym reveals. Reveals. We could also use the synonym illustrates because it shows it as a diagram or as a picture. Another option would be displays. Displays. So these are always some good synonyms that you can use instead of always using the word shows. The next word here, percentage, we could say proportion. Proportion. Rate. The word rate is a synonym of percentage. Rate. Make sure that you can spell the word percentage because it's a very common word in IELTS, specifically in task 1. So just check your spelling. For the school-aged population, it's actually talking about children and teenagers. So we could say children and adolescents. Adolescence is a more formal academic word, but it means teenagers. The word receive, move this. The word receive, we could use the synonym had access to. So this means that children and adolescents had access to secondary education, which means they could actually go to school. We could also use the synonym acquire, who acquire. A third synonym would be obtain. And this is a very common synonym in IELTS. So is acquire, acquire. It's a more formal way of saying to get. By region, we could say by part of the world. Now, in a minute, you'll see that it's not actually countries, but it's continents. So, for example, we couldn't say Asia is a country, Asia is a continent. There are many countries in Asia. So we could say continent or even area. And finally, gender, we could say boys and girls, if we're talking about school-aged population, and men and women if we're talking about adult population. So remember those synonyms because you will need them to write your introduction. Okay, let's look at the diagram. Okay, so the first diagram here is showing us secondary education by region and gender. So one thing you need to do in IELTS is to understand the different parts of an academic diagram. So this diagram here is a bar graph or a bar chart. Both are acceptable. And you'll see that there are two lines. Now these lines are called the axis or axes. Now the line that you can see here with the 0, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 to 100 is the vertical axis. So a bar graph and a line graph always has a vertical axis, and usually there is a number shown. So in this case, it's showing the percentage of the school-aged population. Now remember, that's the percentage of the total population. It's not just the population. It's the percentage of the population. And the second line down the bottom here is called the horizontal axis. And the same thing is true for a line graph. A line graph and a bar graph both have horizontal axis. Now, usually with a line graph, the horizontal axis will show the year, maybe the month, but in this case, it's showing us 4 different regions or parts of the world. So the first one here is Europe, then SSA. Now, SSA means Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and East Asia. So that's the horizontal axis. So the next part we're looking at is called the key. So the key is right here. The key is explaining to you what the different colors mean or represent in the diagram. So in this case, the blue bar represents men or males or boys, and the red bar represents or shows females. So in this case, girls. So the first bar graph here is showing us secondary education. The second one is higher education. You'll see it's very similar to the first diagram we looked at. It has a vertical axis, but this one shows us the percentage of the adult population. The horizontal axis is exactly the same. It shows us the region, Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and East Asia. You can see here that SSA means Sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so that's pretty clear. Moving on. Okay, similar, it has a vertical axis. All right, now another very important thing you need for task 1 are various expressions to write about percentages. Just saying at 50% can make your writing a little bit boring. So it's always a good idea to use vocabulary to express percentages instead of just copying the number that's there. Because of course this shows your vocabulary. So if you look on my screen here, you can see I've given you some various fractions for describing percentages. So the lowest one here, 5%, we would call 1 in 20. 1 in 20. 10% is 1 in 10. 20% is a fifth. It's 1 over 5. A fifth. 20%, a fifth. 25%, a quarter. 30% less than a third, because a third is 33%. 35% is more than a third. 40% is 2/5. 45% is more than 2/5. 50%, of course, is a half. 55% is more than half. 60% would be 3/5. 65%, or more accurately 66%, is 2/3. 70% would be 7 and 10. 75% is 3/4, and 80% is 4/5. But it doesn't always give you exact percentages, so you're going to need to use some qualifiers to write about these percentages in your writing. So if the percentages are not exact, which they usually are not, for example, 32%, then you can use qualifiers to make sure your description remains accurate. And it also shows your vocabulary as well. Here are some examples. So 77%, we could say just over 3/4, but we could also say approximately, about, around 3/4. So both of those are acceptable. If the number was 49% or 48%, we could say just under or just below a half, or nearly a half. 32% would be almost a third, because it's almost 33%, but not exactly. Now, there's some also very general phrases you can use. If it's a very small number, so if it's, say, 2% until 5%, we could say a very small number. Between about 10 and 15%, a minority. Between 65 and 75% would be a significant proportion or a large proportion. And between 75 and 85% would be a very large majority. If you're getting close to 100%, we could use phrases like almost all. And of course, if it is 100%, we could say all. Okay. So the next step that we need to take is we need to analyze the diagram. It is very important to understand the diagram before you start writing. So it's a good idea to spend a few minutes planning and taking a few notes. Okay. So I'm going to give you a few questions now just to think about. So the first question here is, how many diagrams are shown and what type are they? So the IELTS examiner is looking for if you can identify different kinds of diagrams. And you can see that there's a few behind me on the wall here. There's a picture and a flowchart. So today we're going to look at 2 bar charts. So a good way to start would be information is provided by 2 bar charts. The next question is, do the diagrams show a change or a difference? And why? How do we know this? Now, if we look at this diagram, you'll see that there is no time period given. So you cannot describe a change because, of course, change happens over time. Something increases or decreases over many months or many years. So this diagram has no time period. So all we need to do is talk about the differences between the various things. So we're comparing men and women, and we're comparing different regions. So in this case, we're focusing only on difference. The diagrams show a difference in the access to secondary and higher education among children and adults in various parts of the world. Now you can see in this sentence that I have paraphrased. I've used some of my synonyms from before to write a sentence about what is being compared. So there was a difference between secondary and higher, and a difference between children and adults, and a difference between men and women as well, which we'll talk about later. Note, because no time period is given, we cannot describe a change. So when you look at the diagram, always check to see if there is a year provided. If it's only 1 year, it would be difference. But if there's many years, then we would be describing a change. So our first question here is, what does the vertical axis represent? Represent means what does it mean?